Okay, welcome back to our Jepson mini workshop on biodiversity challenges, California floristics, taxonomy, and phylogenetics. And this is a short module 5 on evolutionary complexity and phylogeny-based taxonomy. And the first point I want to make is that getting back to why it's important to have monophyletic taxa, I alluded to this earlier, but maybe I didn't make enough of a point of it, that criterion of monophyly as the basis, fundamental basis for taxa is important for maximizing the information content of our taxonomic classification for comparative biology. That is, in comparative biology, we want to be comparing closest relatives. We want to not have a taxonomy that's misleading about relationships. And in conservation biology, we definitely need to be aware of the evolutionary lineages that are out there to maximize conservation of the tree of life. And if we have a taxonomy that's not based on monophyly, there's real potential for it to be biologically misleading. Now, the one thing I want to talk about here, though, is that evolution can be complex. For example, as I just mentioned in the question answer, the previous module, it can involve hybridization and gene flow across lineages, which can really confound our understanding, our ability to reconstruct relationships. So there are limits to what taxonomy can express in terms of complex histories. So I'm going to just jump into the example that I've studied for my whole career, the Tarweeds and silverswords, as an example of evolutionary complexity that has some taxonomic, that led to some taxonomic conundrums. So the California tarweeds, a group that includes about 21 genera, mostly endemic to California, or at least most of the species therein are endemic to the California floristic province. Comprises mostly annuals like Leah and Media, and has long been recognized as subtribe Medianae, a group within the sunflower family. But as long ago as 1852, before Darwin's Origin of Species, Asa Gray placed the genus Argyrosiphium, which is the genus of true silverswords and greenswords, into the Medianae with the California tarweeds. And this was something that hard for a lot of people to really appreciate or to accept based on the major morphological and ecological differences, especially vegetatively, between these groups and this huge biogeographic disjunction. Carlquist made a really strong case for it based on anatomy, showing a lot of unifying traits there. And we were able to show long ago that the silversword alliance is not only most closely related to the California tarweeds, but it's actually phylogenetically nested within the California tarweeds. This red box here includes representatives of the 3 Hawaiian silversword genera. Again, a monophyletic group nested within a paraphyletic grade of California tarweeds, and even nested within a paraphyletic grade of members of the Media lineage, so one of the 4 major groups of California tarweeds. So this result makes it pretty clear that this nestedness of the silverswords within the California tarweeds, the dispersal must have happened from Western North America to the Hawaiian Islands, and that happened well after the California tarweeds had started diversifying. And also that the woodiness that's found throughout the Hawaiian group is derived from herbaceousness in this Californian grade because of the nestedness of the group. It also created some taxonomic issues that were already resolved by the time this tree was produced. But what I'm calling the Media lineage here in pink, the continental members, except for the Hawaiian ones here, were almost all in the genus Media, with a couple of exceptions. This Anisocarpus and this Carlquistia were in Railardiopsis. And so there was a real issue there with regard to taxonomy. So one solution would be to lump all these things into the genus Media, including the Hawaiian ones. But that would make a very heterogeneous genus Media that couldn't be diagnosed morphologically very easily. And the Hawaiians would have killed me if I did it, frankly. So for self-preservation, in part, that was an impetus not to do that. But breaking up Media into these smaller genera that are actually quite divergent and well diagnosed morphologically made a lot more sense. So that was a situation that was kind of a conundrum, though, because it did involve having to recognize quite a few different Californian genera there. And there are additional complications that came down the line. So looking in more detail at the relationships within the Hawaiian group, we found that the generic boundaries didn't necessarily reflect the relationships very well because of adaptive radiation, where we have this highly accelerated diversification in terms of rate of change as well as the extent of change. There's things like the Iliao Wilksia that been treated generically distinct that were more closely related to some of these subset of the Debaudias that occur nearby in very different habitats than they were to other Debaudias. And these Debaudias, of course, were more closely related to Wilksia than other Debaudias. We have these like fibrous leaved rosette plants growing in dry habitats. We have clambering shrubs growing into openings in wet forests. We have a shrub that grows in bogs, really different challenges to plant growth, and a liana or woody vine growing in mesic forests, which are quite different from wet forests in terms of the overall habitat. So a big adaptive radiation here that kind of clouded understanding of relationships. And we're still in the process of analyzing data from hundreds of nuclear genes to try to understand better the degree to which hybridization factored into this overall radiation, which could further, so we've held back on generic revision until those data are clear, because it could be that the data we have, even though from multiple sources, could be somewhat misleading. And also, it's important to think about the relationship of the California tarweeds to the silverswords in terms of trying to reconstruct the ecological history of the Hawaiian species. And fortunately, this understanding that the members of the Media lineage are more closely related to the silverswords than any other California tarweeds are allowed us to recently publish a paper. It says in press, but it came out recently, that indicates that actually the ancestral condition was one of dry adaptation, as you might guess. But the surprise was that they'd only transitioned from dry to wet habitats over time, and there hadn't been any transitions back to dry habitats. So this understanding of the relationships with the California taxa has really been important to figure out that this adaptive radiation's been a little more constrained than we thought. But this is difficult to actually, this relationship is difficult to embody in the taxonomy. I mean, it's possible we can come up with a taxon between the rank of subtribe and genus to recognize a clade that includes the Media lineage and the Hawaiian silversword alliance. I've been informally just calling it the Media lineage, but including the silverswords. We can, of course, use in the International Code of Nomenclature, we can make up ranks if we want in between existing ranks. So there's not a major problem. It could be a super genus, for example, but it's not currently embodied in the taxonomy. And also, we do know that the ancestor of the Hawaiian silverswords was of hybrid origin. So here we can see gene copies from one of the two genomes in the Hawaiians, which are tetraploid, this floral homeotic gene. And here are gene copies of the same genes from the other genome from those very same individual plants. So what we see, though, is that each of these gene copies comes out as a natural group, as we expected. All the members of the Hawaiian group seem to constitute a clade, but they're not sister to each other. They're each sister to different California tarweed species in the Media lineage, which indicates that the silversword alliance was of ancestral hybrid origin involving a hybrid between extant California tarweeds that, to our knowledge, no longer exists, a allopolyploid ancestry, and trying to represent that in the taxonomy, that hybrid ancestry. There's not a great way to do that for an entire clade of multiple taxa. If it was just one species, we could put the time sign in front of the name, and that would get across that it was of hybrid origin. But you can't really do that for an entire clade very easily, especially of multiple genera. So that's something that is a limitation of our taxonomy. And in the phylocode, as I just mentioned in the question and answer previously, there's really no way to deal with this kind of a situation where you have an allopolyploidization like this, a wide hybridization in expressing that. And I just do want to mention in closing that it is possible even today to make hybrids that are viable between representatives of these two diploid lineages that are closest relatives to different genomes of the Hawaiian silversword alliance. And here is such an F1 hybrid. It didn't produce much viable pollen, but the pollen it did produce was diploid, not haploid. And so it's the raw material there for producing an allopolyploid comparable in composition genomically to the ancestor of the Hawaiian silversword alliance. So even now, millions of years, we estimate about 3.5 million years since the Hawaiian ancestor originated. Despite all that time since that ancestor was created, you can still produce such hybrids. Okay, so I can just open it up to questions with regard to that short module now.